I signed my husband's death certificate with his blood still on my hands while my premature baby fought for his life in the neonatal intensive care unit. That was the exact moment my family walked into the hospital wearing floral resort wear and sunglasses. My sister looked at my baby in the incubator and told me not to ruin their trip to the Bahamas. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply told them to leave and never come back. 7 years later, they came crawling back, begging for money because they were being foreclosed on. They had no idea I was the one holding their mortgage, and I had already drafted their eviction notice. My name is Zaria, and I am 39 years old. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who only used you for their own gain, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to hear exactly how I dismantled my family's financial security piece by piece. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me anchored to reality. The hospital hallway was freezing, but I could not feel the cold. I stood outside the glass wall of the neonatal intensive care unit, staring at my tiny son, Jalen. He was born prematurely just hours after the car accident that took my husband, DeAndre, from us. My hands were still trembling. The ink from the pen I used to sign the death certificate felt heavy on my fingers, mixed with the dried blood from the crash. My entire world had been shattered in a single afternoon. I was numb, waiting for the doctor to tell me if my baby would survive the night. Then the unmistakable clatter of rolling luggage broke the silence of the intensive care ward. The sound echoed loudly off the linoleum floors. I turned around expecting to see medical equipment being moved. Instead, I saw my family. My father, Reverend Elias, and my mother, Corinne, were walking down the hallway, dragging heavy designer suitcases. Right behind them was my older sister, Kendra, and her husband, Trent. Trent is a white financial broker who always looked down on my husband and me. They were not dressed for a hospital. They were not dressed for mourning. They were wearing floral resort wear sandals and sunglasses. My brain could barely process the sight of them. My husband was lying in the morgue and my newborn son was hooked to a dozen tubes fighting for breath. And here was my family dressed for a tropical vacation. My mother, Corinne, stopped a few feet away from me. She did not reach out to hug me. She did not ask how Jalen was doing. She let out a heavy sigh and looked at her watch. She glanced through the glass at the incubator and then looked back at me with a look of inconvenience. God called DeAndre home, Zaria, she said, her voice devoid of maternal warmth. It is a tragedy, but it is his will. We prayed for him in the Uber on the way here. I stared at her, unable to comprehend the words coming out of her mouth. You prayed in the Uber, I repeated, my voice cracking. Mom, DeAndre is dead. Jalen might not make it to morning. I need you here. I need my family. Kendra stepped forward, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Her floral sundress was pink and inappropriate for the hospital. Look, Zaria, we are sorry about DeAndre, she said, crossing her arms. But Trent paid top dollar for the VIP resort in the Bahamas. The flights leave in 3 hours and the tickets are non-refundable. You know how stressed Trent has been with his investment firm. He needs this vacation. We all need this vacation. Trent stood next to her, jingling his keys. He looked around the hallway in disgust. He stepped closer and offered me a patronizing smile, the kind of smile he always used when he wanted to remind me of my place. Listen. Zaria, grief makes people irrational, he said in that condescending tone. There is nothing we can do here. The doctors are handling the kid and DeAndre is gone. Why do not you call his parents? They should be the ones dealing with this. Do not ruin this trip for your sister. She has been looking forward to the beach. His words hung in the air. My brother-in-law was telling me I was being irrational for wanting my parents at the hospital on the worst day of my life. I looked at my father, hoping the man of God would step in and do the right thing. Reverend Elias adjusted his shirt. Your sister is right, he said, refusing to meet my eyes. We cannot throw away thousands of dollars. We will call you when we land. Stay strong and trust in the Lord. They were going to leave. They were going to walk out of the intensive care unit and fly to a beach resort while I buried my husband and prayed over my dying baby. The realization hit me like a physical blow. All my life I had been the reliable one, the strong black woman who fixed all their financial messes while Kendra got all the praise and the financial handouts. Now when I was drowning in grief and trauma, they could not even spare me a single night of comfort. I looked at my mother, then at my father, then at Kendra and Trent. The hot tears that had been threatening to fall suddenly dried up completely. A cold, hard, frightening clarity washed over my entire body. I stood up perfectly straight, squared my shoulders, and looked Trent dead in the eye. "Leave," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. "Leave right now and never come back. Word count is 1,000. My mother gasped, in mock offense at my words, but I did not flinch. I turned my back to them and placed my hands flat against the cold glass of the incubator. I heard my father mutter something about disrespect, and the heavy rolling of their suitcases slowly faded down the hospital corridor. They actually left. They walked out of the intensive care unit and boarded a plane to the Bahamas while I prepared to bury my husband. That night was the longest night of my life. I sat in a plastic chair next to Jalen, watching his tiny chest rise and fall with the help of the ventilator. I promised him that if he fought hard enough to stay with me, I would spend the rest of my life protecting him from the people who abandoned us. Jalen survived the night. By the grace of God, his vitals stabilized the next morning. 3 days later, we held the funeral for DeAndre. The sky was overcast, casting a gray shadow over the cemetery. I stood at the front pew of the church, feeling completely hollowed out. My friends and DeAndre's family surrounded me with love and support. My parents and my sister were nowhere to be found when the service began. They arrived an hour late, sliding into the back row just as the pastor was giving the eulogy. They were sporting fresh, dark tans and looking completely rested. My mother wore a black dress that was clearly bought at a resort boutique. Kendra was busy checking her phone instead of listening to the prayers. I did not look at them during the service. I kept my eyes fixed on the mahogany casket. After the burial service concluded at the cemetery, the guests began to disperse. I was standing near the gravesite holding a single white rose when Trent approached me. His face was flushed, and he had the audacity to smell like coconut sunscreen. "Zariah," he said, stepping too close to my personal space. "Listen, I know things were tense at the hospital, but we are family. You are a single mother now, and you are going to need help managing DeAndre's life insurance. I am a professional financial broker. I can take those accounts off your hands and invest the money so you do not burn through it all." He assumed I was broke. He assumed that because DeAndre ran a small logistics company, we had nothing. He was looking at me not as a grieving widow, but as a potential client he could squeeze for commission fees. I looked at his smug, sunburned face and felt nothing but absolute disgust. "I do not need your help, Trent," I said evenly. "Do not ever speak to me about my husband's money again." Trent scoffed and shoved his hands into his pockets. "Fine," he muttered. "Drown in debt for all I care. Do not come crying to your parents when the bank takes your house." I turned and walked away from him, dropping the white rose onto the casket. That was the last time I spoke to them for 7 years. The morning after the funeral, the house was suffocatingly quiet. The kind of quiet that rings in your ears and makes your chest ache. Jalen was asleep in his crib at the hospital, completely unaware that his father was never coming home. I sat at my kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My phone had been entirely silent. There was not a single text or call from my parents or my sister Kendra to check on me. They were probably still unpacking from their island vacation or recovering from their flights. I felt a deep, hollow emptiness inside my chest, but I knew there was no time to wallow in my grief. I had to secure a future for my son. I had an important appointment to get to. At exactly 10 in the morning, I walked into the sleek downtown office of Mr. Stevens. He was DeAndre's estate lawyer and a close personal friend of my late husband. The receptionist offered me a bottle of water with a highly sympathetic smile, but I declined. I just wanted to get this over with. I sat in the waiting area, bracing myself for a difficult conversation. I assumed we would be discussing a modest life insurance policy and the transfer of the deed to our small house. DeAndre owned a local logistics company that did fairly well, but we lived very modestly. My brother-in-law, Trent, had always mocked DeAndre's business, calling him a glorified delivery boy at every family gathering. I prepared myself mentally to figure out how to stretch a basic life insurance payout to cover Jalen's future medical bills and my living expenses while I took an extended maternity leave. Mr. Stevens ushered me into his large mahogany-paneled office and closed the heavy wooden door behind us. He did not offer the usual empty platitudes about grief that I had been hearing all week. Instead, he looked at me with a profound sense of respect. "Zariah," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "DeAndre was an incredibly intelligent man. He loved you and Jalen more than anything in this world. And he was very aware of the toxic family dynamics you were dealing with on a daily basis." I frowned slightly, confused by his words. "What do you mean, Mr. Stevens?" I asked. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder. He pushed it across the shiny wood surface toward me. "DeAndre knew that your parents and your sister constantly drained you financially," he explained softly. "He saw how they guilt-tripped you into paying for things they could not afford, and he saw how your brother-in-law, Trent, treated you both. DeAndre made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, your family would not be able to touch a single penny of his life work." My hands trembled as I opened the binder. The pages were filled with legal jargon, bank statements, and corporate structures that I immediately recognized. DeAndre's logistics company had not just been doing well. Over the last 5 years, he had quietly secured 3 massive government supply chain contracts. He had never bragged about it to anyone. He never bought a flashy sports car or a bigger house to show off. Instead, he had funneled almost all of the corporate profits into an ironclad, irrevocable trust fund. DeAndre would come home in his work boots smelling like diesel, and I would tease him about being a boss who still did the heavy lifting. I had no idea he was doing it to keep his business overhead low so he could funnel more cash into our future. He played the part of a struggling small business owner perfectly. He let Trent make those condescending comments at every Thanksgiving dinner. Trent would sip his expensive scotch and lecture DeAndre about the stock market, and DeAndre would just nod and smile, knowing he had more liquid cash in one single account than Trent had in his entire fake portfolio. I stared at the bottom line on the account summary page, and my breath completely left my body. The trust set up explicitly for Jalen's education, health, and future was funded with exactly $4 million. I gasped, pressing my hand over my mouth. Mr. Stevens continued, his voice steady and calming. "There is more, Zariah. That is just Jalen's trust fund. DeAndre also took out a massive private life insurance policy naming you as the sole beneficiary. The payout is enough to ensure you will never have to work another day in your life. The house is completely paid off. The logistics company is being sold to his business partner for another substantial sum, which will go directly into your private accounts. You and Jalen are completely financially untouchable." Tears finally spilled over my eyelashes and rolled down my cheeks. They were not tears of grief this time. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. My beautiful, brilliant husband had spent years silently building an impenetrable fortress around us. He knew my family was toxic. He knew Trent was a parasite who would try to swoop in and take advantage of a grieving widow. So he hid our wealth in a maze of legal trusts that no one could ever access except me. He protected us from the grave. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and took a deep breath. Any other widow might have broken down sobbing, or immediately started planning a vacation to escape the heavy grief. But I did not just cry. My mind immediately shifted gears into cold, hard calculation. "You see," I am not just a grieving wife. I am a forensic accountant. My entire career is built on tracking hidden assets, dissecting complex financial webs, and exposing white-collar criminals. I spend my days wiping away the lies people tell to find the dirty truth hidden underneath the numbers. I analyze offshore accounts, shell companies, and tax fraud for a living. I see financial fraud every single day. I see men like Trent all the time. Men who wear suits that cost more than their monthly mortgage payment. Men who lease luxury cars to impress clients while quietly drowning in high-interest credit card debt. The red flags were always there, but I'd been too focused on surviving my own life to properly audit theirs. Sitting in that quiet law office holding the undeniable proof of my husband's absolute devotion, I felt a new sensation replacing the crushing grief. It was a sharp, dangerous clarity. I had millions of dollars at my disposal and the specialized skills of a financial investigator. And my mind immediately went to Trent. Trent, the arrogant white financial broker, who had stood over my husband's casket just yesterday and told me to be careful so I did not drown in debt. Trent, the man who claimed to be so incredibly successful, yet somehow could not afford to lose a couple $1,000s on non-refundable plane tickets to the Bahamas. If he was a high-rolling investment banker, why were my parents so stressed about the cost of that trip? Why did my mother complain about the price of the resort while looking at my dying baby in the intensive care unit? A forensic accountant knows that people who brag the loudest about their wealth are usually the ones hiding the biggest debts. The math of their lifestyle simply did not add up. My parents were a pastor and a retired school worker. They lived on a fixed income. Trent was supposedly rich, but he always let my parents pick up the check at family dinners, under the guise of respecting the elders. The financial ecosystem of my family was a fragile house of cards. And for the first time, I had the capital, the freedom, and the absolute rage required to do some digging of my own. I closed the leather binder and looked up at Mr. Stevens. My tears were completely dry. "Thank you," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Please initiate the transfers into the secure accounts we discussed." I left the law office, walked out into the bright afternoon sun, and got into my car. I did not drive back to the hospital right away. I sat in the parking lot listening to the hum of the engine. I was going to pull on every single financial thread attached to Trent and my parents until their entire fake world unraveled. I was going to find out exactly how they paid for that trip, and I was going to make them regret the day they chose a beach vacation over my family. I drove home from this hospital that evening with a singular focus burning in my chest. After I checked on Jalen in the neonatal intensive care unit and held his tiny hand, I went back to my empty house. The house felt different now. It was no longer a place of mourning, but a command center. I walked into my home office and turned on my computer. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and cracked my knuckles. As a forensic accountant, I know exactly how to follow the money. People lie, but numbers never do. I started with the public records. I pulled up the county property tax database. I wanted to know exactly how much debt Trent and Kendra were carrying on their suburban McMansion. It took me less than 10 minutes to find out that their house was leveraged to the hilt. They had 2 mortgages and a line of credit that was maxed out. Trent was driving a leased BMW, and Kendra was flaunting designer bags, but their net worth was deep in the red. His investment firm, Triton Investments, had a slick website, but the state registry showed multiple complaints and a frighteningly low amount of assets under management. Trent was not a financial genius. He was a con artist wearing a nice suit. But that still did not explain how my parents could afford to drop thousands of dollars on a non-refundable trip to the Bahamas at the drop of a hat. My father was a pastor of a small congregation, and my mother was a retired school administrator. They lived on a fixed income. They clipped coupons. They drove a 10-year-old sedan. There was only one asset they had, that was worth any real money. Big Mama's house. My heart rate spiked as I typed my grandmother's address into the county deed registry. Big Mama's house was a massive, beautiful 4-bedroom property in the historic district of Atlanta. My grandmother had worked as a domestic maid and a seamstress her entire life, saving every single penny to buy that house free and clear. In the Black community, owning a home outright is the holy grail of generational wealth. It is a physical fortress against a world that constantly tries to tear you down. Big Mama paid off that house in blood, sweat, and tears. Before she passed away, she left the deed to my parents with one strict rule: never sell it and never borrow against it. It was supposed to be the safety net for our family for generations to come. It was the place where we held every Thanksgiving dinner, every Easter Sunday, and every repast after a funeral. I hit the enter key, and the property records loaded on my screen. I scanned down the page to the lien history, and the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. There it was, a massive, predatory second mortgage. 3 months before DeAndre's car accident, my parents had signed away the equity of Big Mama's house. They had taken out a loan for $150,000. I pulled the origination documents and stared at the signature line. Reverend Elias and Corinne had signed the papers, but the brokerage firm that facilitated the loan and collected a massive commission fee was Triton Investments, Trent's company. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Trent did not pay for that luxury Bahamas trip out of his own pocket. He coerced my parents into taking out a terrible subprime loan against the only valuable thing our family owned. The interest rate was borderline illegal. He facilitated the loan, took a massive cut for himself to float his failing business, and then used their own stolen equity to take them on a vacation. My parents had literally mortgaged our family legacy so their golden child daughter and her manipulative white savior husband could sip margaritas on the beach while my husband died and my baby fought for his life in an incubator. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up. The anger that washed over me was so intense it made my vision blur. This was not just a betrayal of me. This was a betrayal of our ancestors. Trent had come into our family pretending to be the smart, successful financial guru who would elevate us. Instead, he was a parasite bleeding us dry. And my parents were so completely blinded by their desperation to appease him and spoil Kendra that they handed over the keys to the kingdom. They let an outsider destroy the generational wealth that a Black woman had broken her back to build. They traded Big Mama's legacy for a week at a VIP beach resort. I walked over to the window and looked out into the dark street. The night was completely silent, but my mind was roaring. Any normal person would have called their parents right then and screamed until their throat bled. They would have confronted the family and demanded answers. They would have begged them to reverse the loan. But I was not a normal person. I was a wealthy, grieving widow with the specialized skills of a financial investigator and a heart that had been turned entirely to ice. I did not want an apology. Apologies do not pay back predatory loans, and apologies do not bring back dead husbands. I wanted absolute total destruction. I wanted Trent to feel the exact same terror and helplessness that I felt standing in that hospital hallway. And I wanted my parents to realize exactly what they had sacrificed when they chose Kendra over me. I walked back to my desk and sat down. I opened a new spreadsheet to map out the debt. The predatory loan was completely designed to fail. It was only a matter of time before the bank knocked on their door. But I was always going to get there first. The very next morning, I did not go to work. I drove straight back to the sleek downtown office of Mr. Stevens. The receptionist recognized me and ushered me right in. Mr. Stevens looked surprised to see me back so soon, but he gestured for me to sit down in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what I had found the night before. I explained how my brother-in-law Trent had manipulated my parents into taking out a predatory second mortgage on my grandmother's house to fund a luxury vacation. I watched Mr. Stevens' face shift from professional neutrality to quiet disgust. He was a man who respected the law, and the kind of financial abuse I was describing was exactly the kind of thing that made his stomach turn. "I need you to set up a blind limited liability company for me," I told him, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I want it registered in Delaware to ensure maximum corporate privacy. I want layers of anonymity so thick that even a federal auditor would get a headache trying to find my name attached to it." Mr. Stevens leaned forward, resting his elbows on his mahogany desk. "And what exactly is this corporation going to be purchasing, Zariah?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. I looked him dead in the eye. "Debt," I replied. "I am going to buy the mortgage on my parents' house. I do not want to pay it off for them. I want to own the note. I want to become their landlord." A slow understanding dawned on his face. As an estate lawyer, he understood the sheer power of what I was proposing. Whoever holds the debt holds the power. If I paid off the loan, my parents would just take out another one the next time Kendra and Trent needed cash. They would continue to bleed the family legacy dry, but if I owned the debt, I controlled the property. I controlled their future. Mr. Stevens nodded and pulled a fresh legal pad toward him. "We can move quickly," he said. "These predatory lending firms operate on high-risk margins. If we offer them a lump sum cash buyout for the debt, they will take it without asking any questions. They would rather have guaranteed liquid cash today than deal with a high probability of foreclosure tomorrow." It took exactly 4 days for the paperwork to be finalized. Mr. Stevens set up a shell company called Apex Capital Management. It sounded boring and corporate, exactly the kind of faceless entity that buys up secondary mortgages every single day in America. Nobody would ever suspect that behind the registered agents and the offshore holding accounts, the sole proprietor was a grieving widow holding a grudge. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, I sat in a sterile glass conference room and signed the final transfer documents. I used a fraction of the millions DeAndre had left me to purchase the debt outright. The representative from the predatory lending firm smiled and shook my hand, completely oblivious to the personal vendetta he had just facilitated. As my pen glided across the signature line, a profound sense of shifting power settled over me. Big Mama's house, the physical manifestation of my ancestors. Blood, sweat, and tears was no longer at the mercy of my arrogant brother-in-law. It was mine. The deed, the equity, the very walls of that historic Atlanta home now belonged to me. My grandmother had worked her fingers to the bone as a maid to buy that house. My parents had handed it over to a white financial broker so they could go to the beach. And I had just bought it back. But the most beautiful part of this entire arrangement was the absolute secrecy. My parents and my sister had no idea what had just happened in that conference room. As far as they were concerned, their terrible loan had simply been sold to another faceless corporate entity, which is a very common practice in the subprime mortgage industry. Starting next month, they would receive a formal letter in the mail instructing them to send their exorbitant monthly interest payments to a new P.O. box in Delaware. They would complain about the high interest rates. They would struggle to write those checks every month on their fixed retirement income, and every single one of those checks would be deposited directly into an account that I controlled. I walked out of the lawyer's office and stepped into the cool rain, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The trap was officially set. The steel jaws of my financial snare were completely hidden under layers of legal corporate privacy. All I had to do now was wait. A forensic accountant knows that financial fraudsters like Trent always eventually run out of other people's money. His fake wealth was built on a foundation of sand. It was only a matter of time before his business collapsed and he dragged my parents down with him. When that day came, they would stop making their payments. They would default on the loan. And when they did, the faceless corporation known as Apex Capital Management would be right there waiting to drop the guillotine. I did not completely block their phone numbers. I kept my old phone active just to monitor their descent. Occasionally, my mother would send a passive-aggressive text message on holidays, complaining about how I had abandoned the family. Kendra would post heavily edited photos on social media showing off her designer clothes and her perfect marriage to Trent. They curated this illusion of a wealthy, happy family, completely ignorant of the fact that I was holding the strings to their financial survival. I never replied to the texts. I never commented on the photos. I just watched the numbers in my corporate account slowly tick upward as they struggled to pay the interest on the debt I owned. Jalen grew stronger every single day. After 2 terrifying months in the neonatal intensive care unit, I finally got to bring him home. Holding him in my arms in the quiet safety of my house, I knew I had done the right thing. I hired a wonderful nanny to help me while I went back to work. I threw myself into my job with a ruthless efficiency. I climbed the corporate ladder at my firm, exposing financial fraud and protecting my clients' assets with the same ferocity I used to protect my own. Within a few years, I was promoted to Senior Director of Risk Management. My salary tripled and my investments multiplied. We built a beautiful, peaceful life together surrounded by true friends who became our chosen family. The years ticked by smoothly. 1 year turned into 3, and 3 turned into 7. 7 years of silence. 7 years of my parents writing checks to Apex Capital Management, slowly draining their retirement savings to cover the mess Trent made. I knew the breaking point was coming. The subprime loan had a balloon payment clause that was set to trigger in the 7th year. It was a ticking time bomb that Trent had surely ignored or lied to them about. I knew that when that balloon payment hit, they would not have the cash to cover it, and that is exactly when my peaceful life was finally interrupted. 7 years is a long time to keep a secret. It is an even longer time to build an empire. When Jalen celebrated his 7th birthday, we rented out an entire science museum for him and his friends. Looking at him laughing and running through the exhibits, you would never know he was once a fragile, premature baby fighting for his life in a plastic incubator. He had grown into a tall, strong, vibrant boy with a loud, infectious laugh and his father's bright, intelligent eyes. He was the center of my universe, and I had kept my promise to DeAndre. I had built an impenetrable fortress around our son. My career had skyrocketed in ways that even I had not anticipated. I did not just climb the corporate ladder at my accounting firm, I completely bypassed it. My specialized ability to detect financial fraud, unravel complex offshore accounts, and mitigate high-stakes corporate risks earned me a promotion to Senior Director of Risk Management before I even turned 36. My salary was deep into the high 6 figures, and that was not even touching the massive trust fund DeAndre had left us or the steady stream of income I was collecting from my parents' predatory mortgage payments. Apex Capital Management. My blind shell company had been silently collecting their checks month after month, year after year. Every 30th of the month, a check would arrive at the registered P.O. box in Delaware. Occasionally, the check would bounce, and my legal team would automatically issue a severe penalty fee. Sometimes, the payment included a handwritten note from my mother, directed at the faceless mortgage company, complaining about the harsh terms or begging for an extension. I read every single one of those desperate notes while sitting in my corner office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, sipping artisanal coffee. It was a quiet, hidden justice that fueled my ambition. They were slowly bleeding out financially just to maintain an illusion of wealth, while my real wealth multiplied in the shadows. My daily life was an absolute sanctuary of peace and financial dominance. I drove a sleek black Range Rover Sport that I bought in cash. My suits were custom-tailored. We lived in a beautiful modern home in a highly coveted, gated community in the northern suburbs. We took summer vacations to Europe and spent our winter holidays in Costa Rica. We celebrated Thanksgiving and Christmas with a chosen family of close friends, colleagues, and mentors who loved us unconditionally. I never had to worry about setting an extra plate for toxic relatives. I never had to listen to Trent's condescending financial advice over dry turkey. I never had to watch my mother fawn over Kendra while ignoring my existence. My life was completely drama-free. Jalen never asked about his grandparents or his aunt. They had never made a single effort to contact him or send a birthday card. To him, family meant the people who showed up, and the people who showed up were brilliant, supportive, and kind. I had successfully broken the generational curse of toxic loyalty. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in late October when the perfect bubble of my reality finally collided with the rotting world I had left behind. The morning started exactly like any other ordinary day. I woke up early, made Jalen his favorite blueberry pancakes, and packed his lunch in a sleek bento box. He was wearing his crisp white uniform shirt and navy blue blazer for his prestigious private elementary school. The tuition for his academy cost more than most people's annual mortgage, but I paid it in full every August without batting an eye. We climbed into the Range Rover and I turned on his favorite playlist. We sang along to the radio as we navigated the smooth morning traffic heading toward the drop-off line. The morning carpool line at Jalen's school is usually a highly choreographed routine of luxury SUVs and polite nods between wealthy parents and staff members. I pulled up to the curb, put the car in park, and turned around to give him a high five. "Have a great day, sweetie," I told him, smiling brightly. "I love you, Mom," he replied, grabbing his heavy backpack and sliding out of the heavy car door. I watched him walk safely through the wrought iron gates of the school, greeting his friends and teachers. I felt that familiar wave of immense gratitude wash over me. I had done it. I had protected him and given him the life DeAndre wanted for us. I took a deep breath of the cool autumn air and shifted the car back into drive. I was planning to head straight to the office to review a massive corporate merger file. But as I glanced into my rearview mirror to check the traffic behind me, I noticed something completely out of place. Among the neat line of gleaming Mercedes and Lexus SUVs, there was a beat-up silver sedan with a dented bumper and a badly cracked windshield. It was idling aggressively, blocking the crosswalk and disrupting the flow of the drop-off lane. My trained eyes immediately picked up the visual anomaly. The car looked desperate. It looked like it belonged in a different zip code. I squinted at the rearview mirror, feeling a strange prickle of unease at the back of my neck. Then, the passenger door of the silver sedan violently swung open. A woman stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk of the private school. She was wearing an outdated designer jacket that looked unwashed, and her hair was pulled back in a messy, chaotic bun. She looked exhausted and frantic. It took my brain a full 3 seconds to process the familiar shape of her face beneath the dark circles and the panic. It was Kendra. My golden child sister had tracked me down. And the man stepping out of the driver's side door, looking furious and disheveled, was Trent. The 7 years of peaceful silence had officially run out. The balloon payment on Big Mama's house must have finally hit. Kendra marched directly toward the front bumper of my car, placing her hands flat on the polished black hood. She was physically blocking me from driving away. The other parents in the carpool line were beginning to stare from inside their luxury vehicles. A security guard a few yards away took a step forward, sensing the disturbance. But I raised my hand slightly, signaling that I had the situation under control. I did not want to cause a messy public scene that could get back to Jalen's teachers or the school administration. I pressed the button to lower my driver's side window just a few inches. The crisp autumn air filtered into the leather-scented interior of my SUV, followed immediately by the smell of stale coffee and raw desperation radiating from my sister. "Zaria, turn the engine off," Kendra demanded, her voice sharp and breathy. She leaned down so her face was level with the small opening in the tinted glass. Up close, the physical toll of the last 7 years was painfully obvious. The golden child who had once practically floated through life on a cloud of my parents. Money and adoration was completely gone. The outdated designer bag slung over her shoulder had cracked leather straps, and her fingernails were chipped and unmanicured. She looked hollowed out by the weight of her own terrible choices. "We need to talk to you right now," Kendra said, her eyes darting around the affluent surroundings as if she resented the very air I breathed. I kept my hands relaxed on the steering wheel, resting my manicured fingers on the smooth leather. "I have to go to work, Kendra," I replied, my voice as smooth and cold as glass. "You are blocking traffic in a school zone. Move away from my car before I have security remove you." Trent stepped up beside her, crowding into the small space next to my door. He looked even worse than she did. His face was puffy and flushed, and his cheap gray suit hung awkwardly on his frame, as if he had lost a significant amount of weight very quickly. The arrogant financial broker who had sneered at me in the hospital hallway 7 years ago was now a desperate man drowning in a sea of his own bad debt. "We are not playing games with you," Zaria Trent barked, leaning his heavy weight against my car door. "Your parents are losing Big Mama's house. The bank sent a final notice of foreclosure last week. The balloon payment triggered on the mortgage, and we do not have the liquid capital to cover it right now. On top of that, your mother has a severe arterial blockage. She needs coronary bypass surgery immediately to survive, and the out-of-pocket medical deductibles are astronomical." I stared straight ahead through the windshield, refusing to make direct eye contact with him. The sheer audacity of their ambush was truly breathtaking. They had not spoken a single word to me in 7 years. They had abandoned me in a hospital hallway when my husband died. They had stolen the equity from our sacred generational home to fund their luxury beach vacations. And now that the devastating consequences of their fraudulent actions had finally caught up to them, they fully expected me to open my checkbook and save them from ruin. "That sounds like a personal financial problem, Trent," I said flatly, never raising my voice. "My mother made her choices and you made yours. I am not your financial safety net." Kendra slammed her hand against the glass right next to my face, making a loud thud that echoed in the quiet cabin of my car. "You selfish, ungrateful brat," she hissed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "They are your parents. Mom is going to die if she does not get this heart surgery, and we are all going to be homeless." "We did our research, Zariah. We know what kind of money DeAndre left you. We know you got a massive life insurance payout when he died." She paused, taking a ragged, desperate breath before delivering the most repulsive demand I had ever heard in my entire life. "You need to liquidate Jalen's tuition fund," Kendra commanded as if she still held some sort of familial authority over me. "Pull the money out of his private school accounts right now. You do not need to send a 7-year-old to a private academy that costs $40,000 a year. Put him in a public school and give us the cash to save the family. You owe us this money, Zariah. Mom and Dad raised you." The absolute entitlement radiating from her words hung heavily in the space between us. She actually wanted me to sacrifice my son's education and drain my dead husband's protective legacy to bail out the man who had robbed our family blind. She wanted me to throw Jalen to the wolves, just like they had thrown me to the wolves all those years ago. I turned my head very slowly and looked Kendra directly in her bloodshot eyes. My expression was completely blank and unreadable. I did not yell in response. I did not cry. I did not try to defend my choices as a mother. The heavy silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds, making them both squirm under my cold gaze. Trent let out a harsh, frustrated scoff and ran a shaking hand through his thinning hair. "Listen to me, Zariah," he sneered, his face turning a darker shade of angry red. "We do not have time for your stubborn attitude today. Do not pull the angry black woman routine with us right now. Just hand over the investment account information and I will manage the wire transfers. I am a financial expert. I can restructure your entire portfolio to free up the cash without triggering massive tax penalties for you. You are far too emotional to handle this kind of capital anyway. There it was. The ugly racist microaggressions sitting right on the surface of his utter desperation. Even when he was begging for his financial life on the sidewalk of my son's school, he could not help but try to assert his imaginary white male dominance. He wanted to strip away my power, my intelligence, and my identity by reducing me to a bitter emotional stereotype. He still genuinely believed that I was an irrational woman who desperately needed him to manage her money. I did not get angry at his insult. I did not raise my voice to prove him wrong. Instead, a slow, cold smirk spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of any human warmth. It was the calculated smile of an apex predator watching its foolish prey step willingly into a steel trap. An angry black woman, I repeated softly, letting the words roll around in the quiet luxury interior of my car. No, Trent. An angry black woman would step out of this car and embarrass you in front of all these wealthy parents. An angry black woman would have called the local police to have you permanently trespassed from my son's private academy. I am not angry. I am a senior director of risk management, and you are a highly volatile financial liability. Kendra looked slightly unnerved by my chillingly calm demeanor, but her sheer desperation pushed her forward. Zariah, please, she begged, her voice dropping its demanding edge and taking on a pathetic whine. They are going to take the house, Big Mama's house. You cannot let a bank take our family history. I let the cold smirk linger on my lips. The sweet poetic irony of her pleading with me to save the family house from the big bad bank was almost intoxicating. She had absolutely no idea that there was no bank. She had no idea that the official foreclosure notice sitting on her kitchen table was drafted by my own legal team. She had no idea that she was begging the executioner for a pardon. I will not discuss my private finances in a school parking lot, I said smoothly, keeping my hand on the steering wheel. If you want my financial help, you will do exactly what I say. I know Mom and Dad always host a large Sunday repast dinner. I will come to Big Mama's house this Sunday at 5 in the evening. Bring all the mortgage foreclosure paperwork and the medical bills. We will sit down as a family and discuss my terms. Trent looked instantly relieved, completely missing the lethal danger lurking beneath my measured words. Fine, he muttered, taking a step back from the car and pulling Kendra with him. Sunday at 5. Do not be late, Zariah. I pressed the button to roll the window up, completely cutting off the sound of his arrogant voice and sealing myself back into my quiet sanctuary. I shifted the car back into drive and pulled smoothly away from the curb, watching their desperate figures shrink into nothingness in my rearview mirror. They honestly thought they had won the battle. They thought they had successfully manipulated the wealthy widow into bailing them out of their catastrophic mistakes. They were walking right into the slaughterhouse, and I was going to be the one holding the blade. I drove straight to my office, feeling a strange sense of exhilaration humming in my veins. The Atlanta traffic seemed to part for me. When I arrived at the sleek glass building of my corporate headquarters, I handed my keys to the valet and walked into the lobby with my head held high. The rest of my day was filled with high-level meetings, corporate risk assessments, and million-dollar portfolio reviews. My colleagues saw the same focused and driven senior director they always saw. They had no idea that beneath my tailored emerald green suit, my mind was meticulously planning the total financial ruin of my own family. I knew exactly what kind of trap they were setting for me. A Sunday repast dinner is a deeply ingrained tradition in the Black community. It is usually a beautiful gathering filled with soul-food laughter and prayer. It is a time to honor family and thank God for His blessings. But my parents had always weaponized the Sunday dinner. They used it as a stage for manipulation. They knew that in our culture, you do not disrespect your elders at the dinner table. You do not raise your voice in Big Mama's house. They were planning to use the heavy weight of cultural guilt and religious obligation to crush me into submission. They wanted the entire extended family there to act as an audience and a jury. They figured if aunts and uncles were watching, I would be too ashamed to refuse their demands. They thought they were luring a lamb to the slaughter. They did not realize the lamb had grown into a lion. Friday and Saturday passed in a blur of quiet anticipation. I did not receive any more unhinged visits at Jalen's school, but my phone buzzed several times with text messages from Kendra. She sent me long, dramatic paragraphs detailing my mother's failing health and the imminent threat of the bank taking the house. She laid the guilt on thick, telling me that Big Mama would be rolling in her grave if she knew I was letting the family legacy fall into the hands of a faceless corporation. I read every single text message while sipping my morning tea. I did not reply to a single one. Her desperation was a sweet appetizer for the main course I was about to serve. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear. I woke up early and made a special breakfast for Jalen. I had already arranged for him to spend the entire day and night at his best friend's house. His friend's parents were wonderful people who adored him, and I knew he would be completely safe and happy building Lego fortresses and eating pizza. I dropped him off with a tight hug and a kiss on the forehead. I did not want him anywhere near the toxic wasteland of my childhood home. The collateral damage of what I was about to do would be immense, and I refused to let my son catch even a single piece of the shrapnel. After dropping Jalen off, I went back to my quiet, empty house to prepare. I walked into my home office and opened my heavy steel safe. The metallic click of the lock sounded incredibly loud in the silent room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, red legal folder. Inside that folder was the entire history of my family's greed and my subsequent revenge. There were the original loan documents signed by my parents and brokered by Trent. There was the transfer of deed showing Apex Capital Management as the sole owner of the debt. There were the copies of every single late payment penalty they had incurred over the last 7 years. And resting right on top was a legally binding, fully executed notice of eviction, requiring all tenants to vacate the premises within 48 hours. I placed the red folder carefully into my designer leather tote bag. I spent an hour getting dressed, choosing my outfit with the precision of a general preparing for war. I wore a pristine white silk blouse and dark tailored trousers. I wanted to look successful, untouched, and entirely out of their league. I put on my expensive watch and slid into a pair of designer heels that clicked with authority on my hardwood floors. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, I walked out to my Range Rover and started the engine. The drive from my affluent gated community to my old neighborhood took about 40 minutes. As I crossed the city limits, the scenery began to change. The pristine, manicured lawns of the northern suburbs faded away, replaced by older houses, cracked sidewalks, and fading paint. My chest tightened slightly as I navigated the familiar streets of my childhood. Every corner held a memory. Most of them were tainted by my mother's constant criticism or Kendra's overwhelming shadow. I turned onto Big Mama Street and slowed the car down. The neighborhood was quiet on a Sunday afternoon. As Big Mama's house came into view, I felt a sharp pang of genuine sorrow. The house was physically deteriorating. The once bright white paint on the porch columns was peeling off in large strips. The front lawn, which my grandmother used to keep perfectly trimmed, was overgrown with weeds. The roof looked like it was sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The physical decay of the house was a perfect mirror for the moral decay of the people living inside it. I parked my Range Rover on the street right behind Trent's leased sedan. His car looked dirty and out of place next to my gleaming vehicle. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin of my car for a long moment. My heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. There was no fear. There was no anxiety. There was only the cold, hard certainty of justice. I grabbed my leather tote bag, feeling the solid weight of the red folder inside it. I stepped out of the car and locked the doors. The crisp autumn wind whipped around me as I walked up the cracked concrete path toward the front steps. The wooden stairs groaned loudly under my feet, just like they did when I was a little girl. I stood on the front porch and took one last deep breath of the outside air. I could hear the muffled sounds of multiple voices coming from inside the house. They were waiting for me. The trap was set. I reached out and turned the brass doorknob, pushing the heavy wooden door open and stepping over the threshold into the lion's den. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the stifling heat of Big Mama's house. Conversations in the living room abruptly halted. The silence that fell over the house was thick and heavy, suffocating the usual joyous sounds of a Sunday repast. I stood in the entryway, clutching my leather tote bag, and looked at the faces staring back at me. My aunts and uncles shifted uncomfortably on the worn-out floral sofas. Some of them offered tight, strained smiles while others just looked away, completely unable to meet my eyes. They all knew why I was here. They all knew the family was bankrupt, and they were waiting to see if the estranged wealthy widow would bleed for them. My mother Corinne hurried out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an old stained apron. Her eyes widened with a performative sort of joy that made my stomach turn. "Zariah, my baby!" she cried out, throwing her arms wide open. She rushed toward me, wrapping me in a desperate, tight hug. Her perfume smelled exactly the same, heavy and floral, but beneath it I could smell the sour scent of nervous sweat. "It is so good to see you," Corinne gushed, pulling back to look at me. She reached out and fingered the lapel of my white silk blouse, her eyes darting to the expensive watch on my wrist. "Look at you all dressed up in designer clothes. You always did know how to spend money. It must be nice having so much extra cash lying around when other people are struggling to keep a roof over their heads." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my shirt. "The silk is dry clean. Only mother," I said, my voice perfectly flat. "And yes, it is very nice not having to worry about money." Corinne's fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly plastered it back on. "Well, come on into the dining room," she said nervously, gesturing toward the large oak table. "Dinner is ready. Everyone is hungry." I walked into the dining room, taking a seat at the far end of the table. The spread of food was exactly as I remembered. Fried chicken, baked macaroni, collard greens, and sweet potato pie. It was a feast designed to trigger nostalgia and guilt. Kendra and Trent sat directly across from me. Kendra refused to make eye contact, staring intensely at her empty plate. Trent, on the other hand, sat leaning back in his chair with a smug expression like a poker player who thought he was holding a royal flush. My father, Reverend Elias, took his seat at the head of the table. He cleared his throat loudly, signaling the start of the meal. The ambient noise of chairs scraping against the floor and silverware clinking died down. "Let us bow our heads," Reverend Elias boomed, his deep voice carrying the practiced cadence of a Sunday sermon. Everyone around the table bowed their heads and closed their eyes. I kept mine open, staring directly at my father. "Lord, we thank you for this food," my father began. "We thank you for bringing this family together under one roof. Lord, we ask that you touch the hearts of those who have strayed from the flock. We pray that you remind them of their roots. Remind them that worldly wealth is fleeting, but family is eternal. We ask that you soften hardened hearts and open closed wallets so that we may help one another in our times of desperate need. For it is written that to whom much is given, much will be required." It was the most manipulative prayer I had ever heard in my entire life. He was literally using God as a collection plate. The entire extended family murmured an enthusiastic amen. I picked up my napkin and placed it neatly on my lap. "Amen," I said softly, cutting through the quiet room. "Though I believe the scripture also says that a fool and his money are soon parted." A collective gasp rippled around the table. My Aunt Sarah dropped her fork onto her plate with a loud clatter. Kendra's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with sudden anger. Trent scoffed loudly, picking up his water glass. "There is no need to be disrespectful, Zariah," my father said, his voice dropping its preacher tone and turning cold. "We are trying to have a nice family dinner. I am not being disrespectful." "Dad," I replied calmly, serving myself a small portion of greens. "I am just quoting scripture. I thought that was what we were doing." Corinne quickly jumped in, trying to smooth over the tension before the trap could fully spring. Now, now let us just eat," she said, forcing a bright tone. "The food is getting cold. Try the macaroni zaria. I made it using Big Mama's special recipe. I know how much you loved her. It would just break her heart to look down from heaven and see us lose the kitchen she cooked in for 50 years. I took a slow bite of the food, chewing deliberately. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Big Mama would break her heart if she knew you let a con artist mortgage her house to pay for a vacation, Corinne, I thought to myself. But I did not say it out loud. Not yet. The audience was captivated, and the stage was perfectly set. The dinner continued in agonizing slow motion. Every polite question they asked me was a thinly veiled probe into my financial status. My Uncle George asked about my job at the risk management firm, complimenting me on my success, before immediately asking if I could pull some strings to get him an unsecured business loan. My Aunt Sarah complimented the diamond earrings I was wearing and then casually mentioned how her car had broken down and she was short on rent. It was a masterclass in parasitic behavior. They looked at me, and they did not see a daughter, a niece, or a sister. They saw a walking ATM machine. They saw a wealthy widow who had been successfully isolated from her support system and lured back into the hive to be drained. Trent ate his food quickly, wiping his mouth with a napkin and leaning forward across the table. He was tired of the pleasantries. He wanted his money. "Well, Zaria," he began, his voice loud enough to silence the rest of the room. "The food was great, but we did not ask you here just to catch up. You said in the parking lot that you were ready to discuss terms. We have the foreclosure paperwork right here." He reached down into his briefcase resting beside his chair and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He dropped them onto the center of the dining table with a heavy thud. The time for fake hugs and forced prayers was officially over. The ambush had begun. I took a sip of my ice water, relishing the cold feeling as it washed down my throat. I looked at the stack of papers, then at Trent, and gave him a slow, chilling smile. "I am ready whenever you are, Trent. Let us talk about your debts." The room grew incredibly still as Trent tapped the stack of legal documents against the table to straighten the edges. Before he could speak, my father raised his hand. Reverend Elias wanted to set the moral stage before the financial execution. He leaned heavily onto his elbows, resting his chin on his steepled fingers, and looked at me with a profound expression of disappointed authority. "Zariah," he began, his voice echoing in the quiet dining room. "We did not want it to come to this. We wanted to handle this privately as a family, but you forced our hand by abandoning us. The Bible says, 'Honor thy father and mother, so that your days may be long upon the land.' For 7 years you turned your back on the very people who gave you life. You sat in your luxury house and let your mother and I suffer in our old age." I set my water glass down on the table. My movements were deliberately slow and unbothered. "I abandoned you." I repeated the words, tasting bitter on my tongue. That is an interesting way to rewrite history, Dad. As I recall, I was standing in a hospital hallway with my husband's blood on my hands and my premature baby fighting for his life when you and Mom decided that a non-refundable trip to the Bahamas was more important than my grief. I did not abandon you. I simply took out the trash. A collective gasp erupted from the aunts and uncles. My mother Corinne clutched her chest right over her heart and let out a dramatic sob. "How can you speak to your father that way?" she wailed. "After everything we sacrificed for you, my heart is failing, Zariah. My arteries are blocked. The stress of losing Big Mama's house is going to kill me. And you sit there in your fancy silk shirt calling us trash." I looked at my mother's theatrical display. I knew she had medical issues, but I also knew she was using them as a weapon. I am sorry to hear about your health, Corinne, I said, my voice devoid of any familial warmth. But your medical debt and your mortgage default are not my responsibility. You made financial choices. Now you are dealing with the consequences. My father slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware rattle against the china plates. You listen to me, he thundered, trying to summon the terrifying wrath he used on me when I was a child. You are a part of this family. God blessed you with that money, so you could be a blessing to us in our time of need. It is a sin to hoard your wealth while your own blood faces ruin. I did not flinch. I did not cower. The days of being terrified of Reverend Elias were long gone. I looked right into his angry eyes. God did not bless me with money, I stated coldly. My husband DeAndre worked himself to the bone to provide for his wife and his son. He built a fortress for us because he knew exactly what kind of people you were. You want to talk about sin, Dad? What does the good book say about greed? What does it say about bearing false witness? What does it say about stealing from your own legacy to fund a fraudulent lifestyle? The color drained from my father's face. He glanced quickly at Trent, but Trent avoided his gaze, looking down at the paperwork. They were not used to me fighting back with this much articulate venom. They were used to the quiet, dutiful daughter who just absorbed their abuse and wrote the checks out of sheer obligation. Kendra could not hold her tongue any longer. She slammed her hands on the table and glared at me. Stop twisting the narrative, Zaria, she hissed. You always play the victim. You think you are so much better than us because you have a fancy job and a rich dead husband. But you are nothing without this family. You owe us. Mom and Dad put a roof over your head and fed you for 18 years. You owe them for your life. I slowly turned my gaze to my sister. The golden child was practically shaking with rage and entitlement. I owe them for doing the bare legal minimum required of a parent. I asked, raising one eyebrow. They decided to have a child. Providing food and shelter was their legal obligation, not a loan that I have to pay back with interest. Trent let out a harsh, frustrated sigh. He was tired of the emotional family drama. He just wanted the cash. All right, that is enough, he barked, cutting Kendra off. We are not here to debate the past. We are here to solve a very immediate financial crisis. I shifted my attention back to Trent. The man who had orchestrated this entire disaster was now trying to play the rational mediator. Finally, I said, resting my hands quietly in my lap. Let us drop the fake prayers and the religious guilt trips. I want to hear the exact numbers. I want you to tell me exactly how much money you need to save Big Mama's house and pay for Corinna's surgery. And then I want you to tell me exactly what those documents are on the table. The room grew incredibly tense. The aunts and uncles leaned forward, practically holding their breath. They were watching a high-stakes negotiation and they knew the numbers were going to be staggering. My parents looked at Trent implicitly, trusting the white financial broker to handle the intimidating wealthy widow. Trent cleared his throat, adjusting his cheap tie. The balloon payment on the house is $180,000, he said, trying to sound authoritative. With late fees and penalties, the total needed to halt the foreclosure is exactly $195,000. Your mother's medical deductibles and the out-of-pocket costs for her post-operative care will run another $40,000. We need $235,000 cleared and in my accounts by Wednesday morning. I let the silence hang in the air, processing the sheer audacity of his request. $235,000. He wanted me to hand over $250,000 of my dead husband's money to wipe his slate clean. And what is the paperwork? Trent? I asked, nodding toward the thick stack of legal documents he had placed on the table. Trent smirked, regaining some of his arrogant confidence. He slid the documents across the polished oak wood until they rested right in front of me. "That is the solution to all our problems, Zaria," he said smoothly. I looked down at the thick stack of papers resting on the polished oak wood. The bold black letters at the top of the first page were unmistakable. It was a durable power of attorney. My eyes quickly scanned the legal jargon underneath the title. This was not just a simple agreement to transfer $235,000 to cover their debts. This was a sweeping, all-encompassing legal document that would grant Trent complete and total control over all my financial assets. It included clauses that would allow him to access my bank accounts, liquidate my investment portfolios, manage DeAndre's trusts, and even take out lines of credit in my name. I looked back up at Trent, my face completely devoid of any emotion. "You want me to sign a durable power of attorney?" I asked, my voice eerily calm against the backdrop of their heavy desperation. Trent leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table and clasping his hands together in a practiced authoritative pose. "It is the most efficient way to handle a capital transfer of this magnitude, Zaria," he explained, using his best financial broker voice. "If you just wire the money or pull it directly from your accounts, you are going to get hit with massive capital gains taxes and early withdrawal penalties. As a licensed professional, I can use this power of attorney to temporarily shift the assets into an offshore holding account, shield the funds from the Internal Revenue Service, pay off the balloon mortgage on Big Mama's house, and then return the remaining balance to you. It is a standard wealth management procedure for high net worth clients. It was a complete and utter lie. Any first-year accounting student would know that transferring a widow's trust fund into an offshore account managed by a third-party broker with no fiduciary boundaries was a recipe for total financial ruin. He was not trying to save me from tax penalties. He was trying to steal the rest of my money to plug the massive holes in his own sinking ship. I picked up the pen that rested on top of the documents, but I did not uncap it. I just rolled the smooth metal between my fingers. "Let me make sure I understand this completely," I said, my gaze sweeping around the table. "You want me to hand over the legal keys to every single penny my dead husband left to me and my son. You want me to give total financial control to a man who just admitted he cannot even afford to pay the mortgage he brokered for his own in-laws." The silence in the dining room shattered instantly. Kendra slammed both of her hands flat against the table, standing up so fast, her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "How dare you speak to him like that?" she screamed, her face contorting with rage. "Trent is trying to help you. He is trying to save this family while you sit there acting like some arrogant billionaire. You are just a glorified bookkeeper, Zaria. You play with spreadsheets all day and suddenly you think you are smarter than a real investment broker." I kept my eyes fixed on my sister, rolling the pen slowly between my fingers. "I am a senior director of forensic accounting, Kendra," I corrected her softly. "My entire job is to catch men who do exactly what your husband is trying to do right now." My mother, Corinne, started crying again, loud theatrical sobs that shook her fragile shoulders. "Why are you doing this, Zaria?" she wailed, dabbing her eyes with a cloth napkin. "Why are you trying to punish us? Big Mama built this house for all of us. If you do not sign those papers, we are going to be living on the street by Wednesday. Because you owe us," Kendra shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You owe us everything. Mom and Dad clothed you. They fed you. They paid for your braces and your piano lessons. They dealt with your stubborn, ungrateful attitude for 18 years. You owe this family a debt for raising you, and it is time for you to pay it back. Jalen does not need millions of dollars. He is a child. We need this money right now to survive." The absolute toxic entitlement radiating from my sister was staggering. She genuinely believed that my childhood was a financial ledger and that my parents had kept a running tab of every meal I ever ate. She was demanding the money meant for her own nephew's future to maintain her illusion of suburban wealth. She stood there in her faded designer clothes, screaming that my dead husband's money rightfully belonged to her and her white savior husband because of blood and obligation. I looked at my father, hoping perhaps for a brief second that the pastor would step in and condemn this blatant attempted theft. But Reverend Elias just sat there, his hands folded over his chest, nodding in agreement with Kendra's deranged rant. He wanted the house saved. He did not care if my son lost his entire inheritance to do it. Trent reached across the table and tapped his index finger aggressively against the signature line of the power of attorney. "Sign the papers, Zariah," he demanded, dropping the polite Wealth Manager Act completely. His face was red, and sweat was beading on his forehead. "Sign the damn papers, or I swear to God I will make sure this family never speaks to you again. You will be completely dead to us. You will have no one." He thought the threat of isolation would break me. He thought that the fear of being exiled from the family unit would force me to surrender my wealth. He had absolutely no idea that I had been happily dead to them for 7 years and that I was the one digging their graves. I stopped rolling the pen. I set it down gently on top of the fraudulent legal documents. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my white silk blouse, and let a long, slow breath escape my lips. "It is fascinating," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that forced everyone at the table to lean in to hear me. "It is truly fascinating watching all of you sit here and demand my money to save a house that you threw away for a beach vacation." The room froze. The aunts and uncles exchanged confused, terrified glances. The theatrical tears stopped flowing from my mother's eyes. Trent's hand hovered rigidly over the documents. Kendra slowly lowered her pointing finger. The trap had finally snapped shut, but they were the ones caught inside it. "What are you talking about?" my father demanded, his voice lacking all of its previous booming authority. "What vacation?" I did not answer him immediately. Instead, I reached into my designer leather tote bag resting beside my feet. I slid my hand past my wallet and my keys until my fingers brushed the smooth, cold surface of the heavy steel gray digital audio recorder I had purchased specifically for this occasion. I pressed the record button, feeling the subtle click beneath my thumb. If they wanted to threaten me with legal action and isolation, I was going to capture every single word. Then I pulled out the thick, red legal folder. The folder that contained the absolute destruction of Trent and the complete unmasking of my parents' lies. I placed it squarely on the table right next to Trent's fake power of attorney. "Let us talk about Triton Investments. Trent," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on his. "Let us talk about the real reason you need $235,000 by Wednesday." Trent's face immediately lost its smug color at the mention of his firm. A tense vein bulged on his forehead, and his eyes darted nervously toward my father and then back to me. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, trying to quickly regain his composure. "Triton Investments is doing perfectly fine. This is about your parents' house, not my firm. Do not try to change the subject, just because you do not want to help your own mother in her time of need." I reached into my leather tote bag one more time and pulled out my cell phone. I placed it face up on the polished oak table, right next to the digital audio recorder I had just turned on. I tapped the screen, opening the voice memo app, and hit the bright red record button just to make absolutely sure they understood the gravity of the situation. 2 recording devices sitting side by side. No misunderstandings, no taking words out of context. "What do you think you are doing?" my father demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "Turn those things off, Zariah. You do not come into my house and record family business like we are common criminals." "This is not family business, Dad," I replied, my voice calm and steady over the growing panic in the room. "This is a highly aggressive financial transaction, and given the track record of the people at this table, I prefer to have every single word documented." Georgia is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. I consent to this recording. Therefore, the devices stay on. Trent slammed his heavy hand onto the table, violently rattling the silverware and the crystal water glasses. Drops of ice water spilled over the edge of my mother's glass and soaked into the vintage lace tablecloth. "Turn it off!" he yelled, shedding the last remaining layer of his professional wealth manager persona. "You are acting like a paranoid lunatic. I bring you a legally sound solution to save your parents from homelessness, and you sit here trying to interrogate me about my private business. You are going to sign that power of attorney, Zaria. You have to sign it." I slowly pushed the thick stack of legal documents back across the table toward him. "I am not signing anything," I said definitively. "I am not giving you power of attorney over my dead husband's estate. I am not liquidating Jalen's trust fund, and I am certainly not handing over $250,000 to a man who cannot even keep his own lights on." My answer is no. It is a complete and final no. Kendra let out a shrill, screaming wail of frustration. "You cannot say no!" She shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "You have the money. We did the background checks, and we know exactly how much you have. If you do not sign that paper, the bank takes Big Mama's house on Wednesday. Mom will be thrown out on the street with a bad heart. You are literally killing her, Zariah. You are holding the gun to her head." I did not even look at Kendra. My eyes were locked entirely on Trent, waiting for the inevitable explosion. A cornered animal is always the most dangerous, and Trent was completely backed into a financial corner with nowhere left to run. He realized his polite manipulation tactics had failed completely, and now he had to resort to brute force. Trent stood up, towering over the dining room table. His chest was heaving under his cheap gray suit, and he pointed a rigid finger at my face. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with pure venom and desperation. "If you want to play it this way, we will play it this way. You think you are so smart because you have a fancy title at some corporate risk management firm? You think you can just walk away from your legal and moral obligations to your family. I will bury you, Zariah. I will take you to court for elder abuse and financial neglect." The room fell so silent you could hear the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My aunts and uncles sat completely frozen in their chairs, terrified by the violent outburst. My mother was weeping quietly into her hands, completely overwhelmed by the chaos. My father looked horrified, but he still did not tell his white son-in-law to stop yelling at his black daughter. They were all perfectly willing to let this man verbally abuse and threaten me, just so they would not have to face their own financial ruin. "I know the best corporate and family lawyers in Atlanta." Trent continued, his voice echoing loudly off the dining room walls. "Guys who charge $1,000 an hour and destroy arrogant people like you for fun. I will tie up your husband's estate in so much litigation that a judge will freeze every single asset you own. You will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without my legal permission by the time I'm done with you." He was panting now, leaning heavily over the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "I will drain your accounts in legal fees until you are begging me on your knees to sign that power of attorney," he threatened, spittle flying from his lips. "I will drag your name through the mud and show the whole city what a selfish, greedy widow you really are. I will even go after custody of your son if I have to prove you are an unfit mother who abandons her family. You owe this family, and I am going to make sure they collect every single dime." I sat there and let his threats wash over me. "You are going to sue me?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "I am going to completely ruin you," Trent confirmed, a cruel, desperate smile twisting his lips. "You think your little accounting degree is going to protect you against my legal team? I manage millions of dollars, Zaria. I have connections you cannot even begin to comprehend. You are messing with the wrong man. Sign the papers right now, or I make the phone calls tomorrow morning, and your peaceful life is over." The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the space. Everyone was waiting for my reaction. They expected me to break. They expected the threat of a massive legal battle and frozen assets to terrify me into submission. They expected the grieving widow to cry and reach for the pen just to make the screaming stop and protect her child. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I looked at the two recording devices, silently capturing every single one of his unhinged extortion threats. Then I looked up at his red, sweaty face. I smiled. It was not a polite smile, and it was not a nervous smile. It was the terrifying smile of a woman who was holding all the cards and watching her opponent confidently bet his entire life on a losing hand. "Please," I whispered, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade. "Please call your lawyers, Trent. Call them right now. Put them on speakerphone. I would love to hear what the best lawyers in Atlanta have to say when you tell them you want to sue me using money that you do not even have." Trent stared at me, and for the first time since he walked into the hospital hallway 7 years ago, the arrogant sneer completely melted off his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge in the dark, expecting solid ground and finding only thin air. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like a roaring engine. "Call them, Trent." I repeated, my voice steady and unwavering. "Call the men who charge $1,000 an hour. I am sure they will be thrilled to take on a high-profile case for a man whose corporate bank accounts are currently frozen by the federal government." My father frowned, looking back and forth between us. "What is she talking about, Trent?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Why would your accounts be frozen?" Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "She is lying," he managed to choke out, but his voice lacked any of the booming authority he had used just moments before. "She is just trying to distract us from the fact that she will not help her own mother." "It is a bluff." "It is not a bluff," I said smoothly. I reached my hand back into my leather tote bag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and closed around the thick red legal folder I had prepared. I pulled it out and set it gently on top of the polished oak table, right next to his fraudulent power of attorney document. The red cover looked stark and violent against the vintage white lace tablecloth. I flipped the folder open. The first few pages were printed copies of federal indictments and internal audits that were not yet available to the general public. But as a senior director of risk management with high-level clearance and an expansive network of corporate investigators, I had access to things that standard civilians did not. I looked down at the top sheet of paper and then back up at Trent. "Triton Investments," I read aloud, my voice echoing in the silent dining room. "A boutique financial brokerage firm specializing in high-yield alternative investments. Founded 10 years ago by Trenton James." It had a very impressive marketing brochure. "Trent, you promised your clients consistent 12% annual returns regardless of market volatility. You targeted small business owners, retirees, and members of local church congregations. People who trusted a man in a nice suit who used big financial words they did not completely understand." Kendra crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Stop talking about his business," she demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "You do not know anything about investment banking. You just crunch numbers in a cubicle somewhere." "I know exactly how a Ponzi scheme works, Kendra," I replied without looking at her. "Because that is exactly what your husband has been running for the last decade." The collective gasp from the extended family was audible. My Aunt Sarah clutched her pearl necklace, and my Uncle George leaned so far forward he almost knocked over his water glass. My mother Corinne let out a tiny whimpering sound that died in the back of her throat. "That is slander!" Trent yelled, slamming his hand on the table again, but this time his hand was visibly shaking. "You cannot just come in here and accuse me of a federal crime. I will add defamation to the lawsuit. It is not slander if I have the paper trail to prove it." I countered smoothly, pulling a spreadsheet from the red folder and sliding it across the table toward my father. Look at the numbers, Dad. I am a forensic accountant. My entire life revolves around finding the missing money. And Trent's money has been missing for years. He never invested his clients' funds. He just took the money from new investors to pay off the old ones, keeping a massive percentage for himself to fund his leased luxury cars and his designer suits and his expensive vacations. My father put on his reading glasses with trembling hands and looked down at the spreadsheet. He did not fully understand the complex financial columns, but he understood the bright red negative numbers at the bottom of the page. He understood the sheer volume of the deficit. The scheme worked for a while. I continued leaning back in my chair and watching Trent slowly unravel. It always does, as long as the market is good and people are not asking to withdraw their principal. But eventually, the well runs dry. The new money stops coming in. And 3 months ago, the Federal Bureau of Investigation received a tip from one of your former employees. Trent's face went completely pale. The flushed, angry red color drained out of his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and gray. His eyes darted toward the front door as if he was calculating how fast he could run. He stumbled backward slightly, knocking his chair against the dining room wall. "Yes, Trent?" I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I know about the FBI investigation. I know that federal agents have been quietly auditing your firm for the last 90 days. I know that your business accounts were frozen last week, pending a grand jury subpoena. You are not a successful wealth manager. You are a broke, desperate criminal who is weeks away from wearing a federal prison jumpsuit." Kendra started shaking her head violently. "No!" she stammered, her eyes darting between me and her husband. "No, that is not true. Trent, tell her she is lying. Tell them she is just making this up to ruin us because she has always been jealous of me. Tell them, Trent." Trent did not look at her. He stared fixedly at the red folder on the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The absolute silence from the arrogant white savior was the most damning confession of all. He had spent years making me feel small, making my husband feel inadequate, and parading his false superiority in front of my family. Now he was entirely stripped of his armor. He needed $235,000 by Wednesday, I said, addressing the silent, shocked room but keeping my eyes locked on Trent. "He told you it was to save Big Mama's house and pay for your surgery, Corinne. But that was a lie. The balloon payment on this house triggered months ago. He needed that massive influx of cash to pay off a group of aggressive early investors who are threatening to go to the authorities. He was trying to use my dead husband's money to buy himself a few more weeks of freedom before the FBI kicks down his front door. He was going to steal Jalen's trust fund," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "He was going to take the money my husband bled for, and he was going to use it to cover his own crimes. And you, my father, my mother, and my sister were perfectly willing to hold me down and let him do it." My mother buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. My father took off his glasses, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them onto his empty plate. He looked at Trent, the son-in-law he had elevated and praised for years, the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. "Trent, Reverend Elias," whispered, his voice broken and hollow. "Is it true? Did you steal the money?" Trent opened his mouth to speak, but he could not form a single word. The illusion of the wealthy, successful broker was completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces on the dining room floor. The first domino had fallen and the sheer weight of the destruction was suffocating the entire room. But I was not finished. Exposing his criminal enterprise was only the beginning of my revenge. Because the money he stole to fund his fake life did not just come from strangers. It came from the very people sitting at this table weeping over their lost legacy. I reached back into the red folder and pulled out the next stack of documents. The documents that would finally explain the mystery of the Bahamas trip and the true origin of their financial ruin. I pulled the stapled packet of papers from the back of the red folder and slid them across the table, stopping right in front of my father's shaking hands. These are the origination documents for the subprime second mortgage you took out on Big Mama's house. 7 years ago, I said, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet room. Look at the date, Dad. Look at the exact date you signed away the equity of your mother's legacy. It was exactly 3 months before DeAndre's car accident. My father stared down at his own signature. The ink was black, but the truth it held was entirely poisonous. You needed money. I continued slowly walking them through their own disaster. Trent told you it was a smart financial move. He told you leveraging the house was the best way to build generational wealth. But he did not tell you that his firm was already failing. He did not tell you that he desperately needed the massive broker fee he charged you just to keep his own lights on. I watched my mother's face crumple. She was beginning to understand the horrifying timeline. The Bahamas. I asked softly, leaning forward. Do you remember the Bahamas, Corinne? Do you remember standing in the hospital hallway, looking at my dying baby, and telling me you could not miss your flight because Trent paid top dollar for a VIP resort? My mother let out a strangled gasp. No, she whispered, pressing her trembling hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a sudden sickening realization. Yes, I said, nodding slowly, allowing the truth to sink deep into her bones. Trent did not pay for that trip out of his own pocket. He used your money. He took the commission from the predatory loan he forced you to sign, and he used your own stolen equity to buy those plane tickets. You mortgaged Big Mama's house so that Trent and Kendra could sip margaritas on a beach while my husband was put in a body bag. You threw away your generational wealth and you abandoned your devoted daughter to finance a fake vacation for a criminal. The silence in the dining room was absolute and devastating. My aunts and uncles stared at my parents in pure disgust. They had always looked up to Reverend Elias as a moral pillar of the community. Now they saw him for what he really was, a foolish man who sold his family legacy to impress a white con artist. My father looked up at me, his eyes swimming with tears. Zariah, he choked out, his voice breaking under the weight of his guilt. We did not know. I swear to God, we did not know he was stealing from us. We thought he was successful. We thought we were doing the right thing for the family by investing with him. You chose him, I replied, my tone entirely devoid of pity. You chose him over me. You let him disrespect my husband at every dinner. You let him treat me like a burden. And when I needed you the most, you walked away because he told you to. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood for a fraudster, and now you are paying the price. Kendra suddenly slammed her hands over her ears. She looked completely unhinged, her hair falling out of its messy bun. "Shut up!" she shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the walls. "Just shut up, Zariah. None of this matters. It does not matter how the loan started or where the money went. We do not have the money now. The bank is taking the house tomorrow. We are going to be living on the street, and you have the power to stop it, but you are just sitting there torturing us." She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage and desperation. "You think you are so smart with your folders and your spreadsheets?" Kendra yelled, spitting her words across the table. "But Big Mama is going to watch the bank lock us out tomorrow, and she is going to blame you. You are letting a bank take our history when you have millions of dollars sitting in an account. You are a monster." I looked at Kendra. I looked at the sheer panic in her eyes and the entitlement that still clung to her like a second skin. She was still trying to blame me. She was still trying to make me the villain of her story to protect her fragile ego. I stood up from my chair. My movements were slow and deliberate. I reached down and calmly buttoned my emerald green blazer, smoothing the expensive fabric over my hips. The entire room watched me holding their collective breath. They thought I was going to leave. They thought I was going to walk out the door and let the bank foreclose on them tomorrow morning. I reached into the red folder one last time. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper bearing a bright red notary seal at the top. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling the incredible weight of 7 years of patience and silent planning culminating in this exact second. Kendra, I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. You keep talking about the bank. You keep blaming this faceless financial institution for taking away your home. I dropped the document onto the center of the table right on top of Trent's fake power of attorney. The paper landed with a soft, terrifying thud. There is no bank, I said. My father frowned, wiping his tears and staring blindly at the paper. What do you mean there is no bank? He asked, his voice trembling in confusion. The letters come every month from Apex Capital Management. They hold the deed. They sent the final notice. I looked directly into my father's eyes and delivered the kill shot. I am Apex Capital Management, I stated clearly. I formed the Blind Limited Liability Company 7 years ago. I used the money DeAndre left me to buy your predatory loan from the original lender. I am the debt holder. Every single exorbitant interest check you wrote for the last 7 years went directly into my personal accounts. I watched you bleed yourselves dry to cover Trent's mistakes. The shock that hit the room was a physical force. Kendra's jaw dropped open. My mother stopped crying, completely paralyzed by the revelation. Trent stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known before. His chest heaved as he realized he had been sending his stolen money directly to the woman he despised. And that document on the table? I continued, gesturing to the paper with the red seal. That is not a foreclosure warning. It is an eviction notice. I am not foreclosing on the property. I already own it. And I am evicting you. All of you. You have 48 hours to pack your belongings and get off my property before I have the county sheriff throw you out on the street. Absolute chaos erupted in the dining room. My aunts and uncles jumped out of their chairs, shouting and crying in disbelief. My mother let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed sideways, clutching her chest in a dramatic display of panic. My father rushed to her side, sobbing and begging God for mercy. Trent let out a guttural sound that was half roar and half sob. He lunged across the table, his heavy body knocking over water glasses and sending plates of macaroni and fried chicken crashing to the hardwood floor. He was reaching for the eviction notice, his hands clawing wildly at the air, as if ripping the paper would somehow undo the reality of his total destruction. He did not even make it halfway across the table. Before his fingers could graze the document, the heavy front doors of the house swung open. 2 massive private security guards stepped into the dining room. I had hired them the day before, instructing them to wait outside in an unmarked SUV until they heard yelling. They moved with swift military precision. One guard grabbed Trent by the collar of his cheap suit, yanking him backwards so violently that he slammed into the floral wallpaper. The other guard stepped firmly between me and the rest of the hysterical family. "Do not touch her," the guard warned, his voice booming over the screams. "Step back immediately or we will forcefully remove you." Trent was struggling against the guard, panting and spitting, his face purple with rage. "You cannot do this," he screamed at me, his voice cracking. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. You ceased being my family the day my husband died." "Trent," I replied, picking up my leather tote bag and turning to leave. "I will see you in 48 hours. If there is a single scratch on these walls, I will deduct the repairs from whatever miserable assets the federal government does not seize from you first." I walked out of Big Mama's house, surrounded by my security detail, leaving the audio recorders on the table as a parting gift. The crisp evening air felt cleaner than it had in years. I got into my Range Rover and drove back to my peaceful, affluent life, leaving the toxic ruins of my past burning in the rearview mirror. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic, pathetic desperation for them. They tried to call me hundreds of times. They sent flying monkeys in the form of aunts and uncles to beg for mercy at my corporate office. I blocked every single number and instructed building security to turn them away. When the deadline arrived on Wednesday morning, I sat in my corner office sipping coffee and watched the live feed from the security cameras I had ordered installed on the property the day before. It was pure, beautiful karma. I watched my father and Kendra carrying cardboard boxes out to the curb. My mother was sitting on the grass looking completely lost, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders. Trent was nowhere to be found. He had abandoned them exactly like he abandoned me, leaving his wife and his sick mother-in-law to deal with the physical labor of their eviction while he tried to figure out a way to save his own skin. But there was no saving Trent. Later that same week, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially raided his suburban mansion. The news broke on all the local Atlanta channels. Trenton James, the arrogant white savior who thought he could steal from the black community and get away with it, was led out of his house in handcuffs, wearing a crumpled t-shirt and sweatpants. His firm was seized, his accounts were completely drained by federal agents, and he was facing 20 years in federal prison for running a massive Ponzi scheme and committing wire fraud. Kendra was left with absolutely nothing. Her designer bags and her leased luxury cars were confiscated by the government to pay back the defrauded investors. She was forced to move into a tiny cramped apartment in a bad neighborhood with my parents living entirely on my father's meager pension. They were utterly humiliated and completely shunned by the church congregation, who finally learned the truth about how their beloved pastor funded his lifestyle. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. They built their own prisons out of greed and entitlement, and now they had to live in them. I had finally avenged my husband, protected my son, and reclaimed my ancestors' legacy. I was free. 2 weeks after the eviction, I stood on the cracked sidewalk across the street from Big Mama's house. The autumn leaves were falling, covering the overgrown lawn in patches of brown and gold. The house was completely empty. The heavy wooden door was padlocked, and the windows were dark. I had hired a demolition crew, and I wanted to be there to watch it happen. Some people might think it was a tragedy to tear down a historic family home, but to me, that house had stopped being a home a long time ago. It had become a monument to greed, manipulation, and toxic loyalty. It was the physical embodiment of a generational curse that I was finally going to break. The yellow bulldozer roared to life, its heavy metal treads chewing up the dead grass as it moved forward. I stood perfectly still, holding a hot cup of coffee, and watched as the massive steel blade crashed into the wooden porch columns. The wood splintered and groaned, collapsing under the sheer weight of the machine. A cloud of dust plumed into the air as the front wall caved in. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. As the roof sagged and the walls tumbled down into a pile of rubble, I felt a profound physical release. The ghost of my mother's constant criticism, the echo of my father's manipulative prayers, and the lingering stench of Trent's arrogance were all being crushed into dust. They traded our family legacy for a cheap vacation, and I was clearing the rotten foundation to build something entirely new. I owned the land free and clear, and I knew exactly what DeAndre would have wanted me to do with it. It took nearly 2 years of planning, zoning approvals, and construction, but I transformed that empty lot into something beautiful. The rotting colonial house was replaced by a modern state-of-the-art facility with wide windows filling the rooms with natural sunlight. We planted a beautiful garden in the back with a walking path and a playground. I named it the DeAndre and Jalen Foundation. It is a comprehensive support center and temporary housing facility specifically designed for Black single mothers who have premature babies in the local neonatal intensive care units. When a mother is sitting in a freezing hospital hallway, terrified that her baby might not survive the night, she does not need to worry about where she is going to sleep or how she is going to pay for her next meal. The foundation provides free private suites, warm meals, financial counseling, and licensed therapy. I created the exact sanctuary that I desperately needed on the darkest night of my life. I made sure that no woman who walked through those doors would ever feel as abandoned as I did. On the day of the grand opening, I stood on the front steps of the new building, holding a pair of giant ceremonial scissors. Jalen was standing right next to me wearing a sharp little suit and a bright smile. He was 9 years old now and he understood exactly what we were doing. He knew this building was named after him and the father he never got to meet. He held my hand tightly, his small fingers warm and reassuring. I looked out at the crowd gathered on the lawn. There were doctors from the hospital, local community leaders, and the mothers who were already moving into the facility. My corporate colleagues were there cheering for me. Mr. Stevens, the lawyer who helped me set the trap 7 years ago, was standing in the front row wiping a tear from his eye. My friends, the people who had held me up when I was falling apart, were all smiling brightly. There was not a single person from my biological family in the crowd. My parents were not there. Kendra was not there. They were living their miserable, cramped lives across town, completely cut off from the beautiful world I had built. And looking at the sea of supportive, loving faces in front of me, I realized something incredibly important. Blood does not make a family. Blood is just a biological coincidence. Family is a verb. Family is the consistent choice to show up for someone when they are at their absolute lowest. Family is the people who protect your peace, who celebrate your victories without jealousy, and who respect your boundaries. My parents and my sister shared my DNA, but they were parasites. The people standing on the lawn clapping for me, that was my real family. That was my chosen family. I cut the bright red ribbon and the crowd erupted into applause. Jalen cheered loudly and hugged my waist. I looked up at the clear blue sky and smiled, knowing that DeAndre was looking down on us, feeling nothing but pride. I had taken the worst betrayal of my life and turned it into a fortress of hope for others. I broke the cycle of toxic loyalty and built a new legacy of genuine generational wealth. Wealth is not just about the money in your bank account. True wealth is having the freedom to walk away from the people who hurt you and the power to build a life surrounded only by love. If you are watching this and you are carrying the heavy burden of a toxic family, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep other people warm. You do not owe anyone your peace, your financial security, or your sanity just because you happen to share the same last name. It is okay to walk away. It is okay to protect yourself. And it is absolutely okay to let them face the consequences of their own actions. The moment you stop carrying their dead weight is the moment you finally learn how to fly. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope it gives you the courage to enforce your own boundaries and reclaim your own power. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own future? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear how you found your own freedom. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal and finding the ultimate revenge through success. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their life belongs to them. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.